and security are seen as being in tension with one another. So the quintessential example of that is the anti-terrorism initiatives, where you had privacy advocates and civil liberties advocates pushing back on what was being done for anti-terrorism. So whether it was border security or airport screening, cameras, surveillance, monitoring. So the privacy position was, let's get less government collection of information. Let's push back on what is being done on the security and cybersecurity side. I think increasingly, though, we should think of privacy and security as effectively doing the same thing. The old debate, in a way that we can think about, is that it was security but privacy. So in that way, it was privacy is necessary, but it effectively takes away from security, or as the privacy people would have said, all you're really getting is false security. The second way to look at it, which is a moderation of that, is security is balanced with privacy. They're both positive values, but effectively they're in tension. And the way that I want to look at it is that it's privacy for cybersecurity, that increasingly privacy is a good in itself, but it also supports cybersecurity, and that increasingly they're working in alliance rather than antagonistically. So the Minister of Democratic Institutions has this mandate letter that talks about analyzing risks to Canada's political and electoral activities from hackers. I think that we've thought of that in terms of data breaches, but I want to open up the discussion to also talk about it in terms of weak privacy regulation that allows that mass data collection in the first place that can then lead to data-related electoral threats, which might include voter ID theft, voter influence, voter susceptibility to disinformation. So what are the data-driven threats to electoral cybersecurity and what causes them? The precondition of this, or at least one of them, is the collection in the first place of mass data and then coupling that increasingly with data analytics. On the privacy law side, there's two sets of gaps that are causing these weaknesses. One is very specifically about election-related privacy regulations. So weak regulations in terms of political parties, campaigns, and campaign consultants. But the other part of it that I'll also address is weak privacy regulation generally. Okay, so privacy law works generally, data protection laws, off of fair information principles. So a set of 10 principles that tries to get both public and private sector organizations to provide more protection to individuals on their personally identifiable information. By and large, Principle 3 has become the focus. So it's been largely about consent in the sense that if we get consent from a user, generally there's not a lot of focus on either limiting the collection, as in Principle 4, or limiting the uses and reuses after that. So this has caused, in my opinion, privacy law weaknesses. By relying on consent, we're relying on a practice which is in fact not meaningful. It's not informed consent in the way that we have in the health sector. It's ineffective because in general, users do not understand what they're consenting to, they don't understand what the nature of the information is, and they don't understand the data analytics that are being used to create inferences from that information. Most users who are engaging with Google or Facebook or Twitter don't appreciate the massive amounts of personal information about them and the multiple sources that are being connected. They don't appreciate the increasing sophistication of big data analytics in this process. So an example that came out just in the past week, there were Canadian researchers that discovered that with court records, We often have them where they are redacted, either because it's a family law issue, juvenile crime, and there's an anonymization of the party that is either a victim or there's sensitivity on them as an accused. It's increasingly becoming the case that those anonymized records are being produced when somebody queries that person's name that has been anonymized. Because Google's algorithm is sophisticated enough now that it's matching these sequential queries and putting them together and producing these court records that were supposed to be private and anonymized. Part of this in terms of users too is, Jeff mentioned this morning, our parents going into Best Buy, picking up the off-the-shelf computer, plugging it in, and going, and we sort of tisk that that's not a good practice. Another way to look at it, though, is that's a perfectly reasonable thing for a user to do, to go to a chain store, pick up a mass-produced device, take it home, and think if they plug it in and it works, that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. We have to think beyond the user to typical ways that these are used and what the law might do in order to sort of step in and either provide incentives or bridge some of these breaches. Okay, so one of the problems is what I'm going to call data promiscuity. It's this mass collection of personal information, the sharing and resharing of the information, pairing that with artificial intelligence and other analytic technologies in a cycle where then we produce more tempting online targets, which might lead to more data breaches and more information. So information is beautiful, which has these lovely visualizations of data. It has this one for 2017, data breaches. The red is hacking and the pink is poor security. However, it's also important to note, as Professor Pell addressed, that some scandals that have produced an awful lot of information were not the result of technical breaches. So Cambridge Analytica was a result of really loose policies that allowed reuse and collection of mass amounts of information. There wasn't a breach. And this shouldn't be surprising because social media companies, as we know, are collecting information as a feature, not a glitch. That is their business model, to collect information, to use it for third-party advertising, to use it for revenue. So it's not a breach, it's a predictable result when that happens of this collection of information. So regardless of the mechanism, whether it's a breach as we traditionally consider it, or something more along the lines of Cambridge Analytica, the result is a massive amount of personal information that can be used to influence elections in different ways. So with data and elections, one part of it is effectively the commodification of voter data. So we've been talking about voter data, but it's important to recognize that there really is no difference between voter data and consumer data. So the information that the political parties are buying and selling are based on things like consumer purchases. They're using similar psychographic models about persuadability that the consumer companies are using. So the same thing to figure out whether you're going to buy fish or meat is also being used to decide if you're going to vote conservative or liberal. So with that little difference between consumer data and voter data and the same practices being used to infer voter persuadability, we really get an enhanced regulatory gap with respect to privacy legislation. One part of it is that we are relying on self-regulation for the political parties on privacy with respect to the voter information that they have, which is much larger than the information that they get through official sources. Effectively, they can now buy information in the same way that private sector companies like third-party advertisers do. And so we have this regulatory gap, not only with respect to sort of the traditional view of political parties per se not being adequately regulated on privacy, but a larger problem with data collection of voters who are also consumers, and the risks of misuse and improper collection because of that. The most obvious way to protect personal information held by parties would seem to be to impose privacy legislation like fair information principles on political parties. It's a bit of a black box, though, with a lot of unknowns as to whether or not that would work and what exactly is being done. The political parties have privacy policies on their websites and other places, but we don't know what information they collect right now. We don't know the sources of that information. We don't know how they store it or with what security or what they do with it in terms of data analysis. We don't know the extent to which the data sharing agreements between the federal and provincial parties are working, and we don't really know who else has access to it. We don't know the security measures that are being used in terms of encryption and other things. We don't know relationships with third parties like the campaign consultants. And we don't really know if they've had breaches and what has happened with that information. So those unknowns are largely because they are not subject to fair information principles, which would impose disclosure requirements on them, transparency and accountability. So right now, for example, if we don't see a privacy policy, we don't know if that's because, well, they're just selling and buying it, so they're not going to put up a privacy policy. We don't know if they're, on the other hand, if they're abiding by privacy principles and simply haven't drafted a policy that would apply to that. So there's two ways in which they're currently unregulated. One is under the Canada Elections Act, it doesn't specifically regulate voter privacy and does not impose fair information principles on them. The other part of it is that they are not part of either the public sector or private sector privacy legislation. So they're not part of the Privacy Act, which covers government bodies because they are not government. They're not part of legislation provincially or federally, so the federal one is for the private sector under PIPEDA. They are not commercial activities and therefore not regulated under that. So effectively a twofold gap in the privacy legislation. Some people refer to it as political parties falling through the cracks. Okay, so possibilities in terms of reform. Really, it would have to tackle several problems in order to produce privacy-sensitive security, but again, I want to emphasize that I don't think that that's a compromise. The security has to be privacy-oriented. It's effectively using privacy in order to buttress cybersecurity. So it's not an either-or, it's in conjunction. So right now, strong privacy protections are conducive to limiting data-related electoral threats. If we think of this as an era of indiscriminate data collection by the tech sector, information privacy protection is data security. So one option on privacy legislation reform is to regulate voter privacy and to regulate it specifically about voters. So a possibility would be to expand the scope of regulated entities that are under current privacy legislation so that it covers political parties, likely under the private sector legislation, both provincially and federally. Another option would be to say political parties are just unlike other private sector entities, and so therefore we need to create a new legislation either that would be under the jurisdiction of the Privacy Commissioner or the Elections Officer. And the Privacy Commissioners have highlighted this as an area that should be fixed. If we were to do that, however, and impose fair information principles on political parties, political privacy gaps would still remain. So we would still have the problem that under our current formula of how those 10 information principles work, they are still largely driven by consent rather than by limiting collection and limiting use. They don't adequately cover things that the EU's GDPR does in terms of artificial intelligence and automated processing. They don't adequately cover the step between collecting the data and the analysis of the data. So they're not very focused on what kinds of inferences are permissible based on data collection. So if we were to rethink what the online data ecosystem should be, so just some thoughts on this. We should not assume social media data practices are benign. So people in this room probably do not assume that. I think people generally do. So for example, schools are often now setting up children with first name dot last name at whatever school they are, putting them on Google Docs, and sort of not thinking through what are the implications of having a child's name interacting with Google in that way. We should not rely on consent, which is not adequate for various reasons, largely because people don't understand what they're consenting to. It's really impossible to tell people what the entire data ecosystem is. If your general user is going into Best Buy and buying a computer, they are probably not also putting together exactly what's going on with their data. We need to focus more on limiting the initial collection of personally identifiable information, and in conjunction with that, limit reselling and third-party uses as well. So I would recommend that, yes, a first step is to impose fair information principles on political parties, but it is a much larger problem than just ensuring that privacy regulations are imposed on political parties. It's more about our entire data ecosystem and the vulnerabilities that that's causing. Thank you.